Myst, Might, Mayhem. By Han Jung-Wioya. Chapter 73. Team Leader. Part 1. Could it be? Yom-Jie of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave frowned, feeling uneasy inside. The reaction to Mok Jaeongun's words about it being a sword formation was unusual. If it wasn't the case, there would have been no reason to react like that in the first place. That can't be. Yom-Jie denied it inwardly. A sword formation, as the name suggests, is a formation deployed using swords. Formations typically have fixed rules and precise variations in stances to interlock with each other, which was difficult to achieve with just the sword technique verses. That meant the verses stances had to be adapted, but this was impossible to envision in one's head just by looking at the verses unless one was at a considerable level. Is that guy such a master of the sword? To be able to notice this just from the verses, one had to be a sword master of the caliber of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave's Valley Master, Yonga's father. That's why Yom-Jie hoped it wasn't the case. However, contrary to his wish. Why do you think it's a sword formation? The demon mask asked Mok Jaeongun in a serious tone. Mok Jaeongun then nonchalantly said, "Judging by how the stances of the sword technique adhere to the basics and each one is arranged so that the movement paths don't overlap, I thought it could be demonstrated as a sword formation." The movement paths don't overlap, the demon mask's eyes narrowed. Even if one could physically demonstrate the sword technique multiple times or visualize the sword in one's mind, it was quite difficult to trace the movement paths to the point of combining them into a sword formation. It was more than observing one's own movements. The demon mask stroked his chin. To be honest, it was hard to believe. A guy who was merely 17 or 18 years old had insight on par with someone who had reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship? Of course, if he possessed innate talent, it could be possible. However, those hands. The palms of Mok Jaeongun's hands that the demon mask was looking at were not like that at all. Those were not the hands of an exceptional swordsman. The shape of a swordsman's thumb, index finger, and pinky naturally changed after gripping a sword for a long time. But looking at Mok Jaeongun's hands, there weren't even any calluses on his thumbs. Those aren't the hands of someone who has mastered the sword. Yet such insight emerged from him. If a sword master had given him pointers, it would be understandable. But there was no way such a person existed here in Corpse Blood Valley. That's why it was even more puzzling. Was this guy's discernment really on par with someone who had reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship? The demon mask, who had been staring intently at Mok Jaeongun, said, "If a sword formation were to be deployed with this verse, how many people do you think would be most efficient?" It was already impressive that he had guessed it was a sword formation. But could he really figure this out as well? If he got this right too, one could truly say his insight regarding the sword was on par with a master. At this question, Mok Jaeongun remained still for a moment and then answered, 8. The demon mask's eyes flickered with interest at those words. He had accurately stated the minimum number required to deploy a sword formation. Then Mok Jaeongun continued, 16 or 32 should also be possible. At those words, a small gasp escaped the demon mask's mouth. It would have been impressive if he had only said 8, but he even accurately guessed the numbers that could form the sword formation. Do you think it would be difficult to go beyond that? If they were to combine, the formation would start to overlap from that point on. At Mok Jaeongun's words, the demon mask sincerely clicked his tongue. The Heaven and Earth 8 Resonance Formation. That was the name of this formation. It was an absolute formation based on the variations of the 8 trigrams, developed by the previous society leader of the Heaven and Earth Society, allowing 16 to 32 swordsmen to launch a combined attack. Look at this guy. He even got this right. Did he really possess the eyes and insight of a swordsman who had reached the pinnacle? If that was the case, he was genuinely intrigued. He didn't care at all that Mok Jaeongun was from an upright martial arts family. The demon mask, who had been staring intently at Mok Jaeongun, licked his lips. He wanted to satisfy that greed right away, but now, during the ongoing examination, was not the time. Smack. The demon mask threw something at Mok Jaehyun. Mok Jaehyun caught it and opened his palm to find a silver tablet with the character 2 engraved on it. The demon mask said, "You are also the second place scorer." Murmur murmur. At those words, the boys watching this stirred. With Mok Jaehyun claiming the second place position following the first, it naturally became a topic of discussion. Just who was this guy? What was his background that he had already taken the second place position? Grit. Yeom-jae of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave gnashed his teeth. He had naturally thought the second place would be his, but he didn't expect it to be snatched away like this. He was one of the 3 most promising disciples from the major factions in this corpse blood valley. But now he looked pathetic. Mok Jaehyun. That guy's name was completely etched into his mind. It seemed like he would only feel better if he could somehow get back at him for this humiliation. Just wait and see. Once the golden gate lock sealing his energy points were removed, that guy better be prepared. As they were doing so, the demon mask spoke. "I sincerely congratulate the 80 of you who have passed the second gate. You have gained the qualifications to become middle-rank warriors of our Heaven and Earth Society." Middle-rank warriors. At his words, exhilaration filled the eyes of some boys. That was because starting from middle-rank warriors, the treatment within the Heaven and Earth Society changed. Among the middle-rank warriors, those with exceptional skills could gain the qualification to lead a unit of low-rank warriors as a unit leader. The demon mask continued speaking to them, whose eyes had come alive despite their exhaustion. To be a middle-rank warrior, one must have the ability to lead a unit and be able to execute a sword formation. As you just heard, the verse on the flag is the verse of a sword technique that requires at least 8 people to deploy as a sword formation. At those words, everyone's eyes flickered with interest. The examination wasn't simply composed of extreme trials. From the beginning, there was a reason why they had to be divided into teams of 8. Now, if you have a keen eye, you should be able to guess what the third gate is. You there. At the demon mask's nod, a boy abruptly stood up from his seat. Yes. What do you think the third gate is? That's. Speak properly. It's for the 8 members who pass to deploy a sword formation and eliminate the target. At the boy's words, most of them nodded slightly, thinking the same thing. That was the only thing they could guess at this point. As they were doing so, the demon mask gestured for him to sit down and opened his mouth. Correct. The third gate is for a team of 8 to perfectly deploy a sword formation and eliminate the target. At his words, the boys inwardly felt relieved. The first and second gates had made them harm each other and exhausted them mentally and physically. If they were told to do it twice, it would be an experience they never wanted to go through again. However, there are conditions and restrictions here as well. Conditions and restrictions? First, you will be given a day of rest, so decide on a team leader during that time. Of course, you must also form a team of 8, including the team leader. Huh? At the demon mask's words, the boys furrowed their brows. This meant that the 8 who had defended the flag didn't necessarily have to be on the same team. In this case, they could reorganize the teams. Great! At this, a few openly cheered. Among them were Yeom-jae of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave and Mok Yu-cheon. In fact, most of them who had been inwardly dreading being on the same team as Mok Jaehyun again showed similar reactions. By the way, the one who becomes the team leader naturally passes the third gate regardless of the sword formation test, and swoosh! The demon mask took out a square wooden tablet that looked like an identity plate from his bosom and showed it. The words "Unit Leader" were engraved on it. Oh? Could it be? Unit Leader's plate? The boy's eyes focused on the wooden tablet. Then the demon mask chuckled and continued. They will also be given the qualification of a unit leader. At the demon mask's words, the boys couldn't hide their excitement even though their mouths were closed. Only a select few among the middle-rank warriors who had the qualifications of A senior could become unit leaders. But were they deciding the unit leaders here? However, a question arose in everyone's mind as they were getting excited. Then won't everyone want to be the team leader? Who among those who had come this far wouldn't want to be the team leader? Realizing this, sighs of distress naturally mixed into the boys' breaths. They thought this gate might be a bit better, but in the end, it seemed like they would have to fight again. Damn it. There are 80 people, so only 8 will qualify. Even that's uncertain. If someone dies while fighting for the team leader position, that team will be eliminated. If even one person met with an accident, 7 others would be eliminated together. It couldn't be considered easier than the second gate by any means. As they were doing so, the demon mask spoke. Now I will state the restriction. The restriction is no killing. At those words, everyone was puzzled. Did the restriction of no killing literally mean they couldn't kill each other? Everyone looked at the demon mask in confusion. They thought he would clarify the reason behind it. However, that is all. That's it? So we have to decide on a team leader without killing? Everyone was dumbfounded by the simple yet different restriction compared to before. On the other hand, Mok Jaehyun smacked his lips as if he was disappointed. He thought he could enjoy it like the second gate, but with the restriction on killing, the fun was gone. This guy. Why is he disappointed? Seeing his reaction, the boys next to him clicked their tongues inwardly. Shouldn't he consider it fortunate instead? At least in this gate, there wouldn't be any loss of life. Clank. At that moment, the red-belted warriors began taking out a peculiar-shaped iron object from a wooden box. The demon mask pointed at it and said, "Before heading to the lodgings beyond the mountain, we will collect the Golden Gate lock." Ah. At those words, everyone's expressions brightened. They had been wondering how long they would have to wear the Golden Gate lock, but they were finally being freed from them. The restriction of not being able to use inner energy made them more uncomfortable than they had thought. Finally, the lips of Yeom Jie of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave twitched. He had waited so long, and the restriction on his inner energy was finally being lifted. Yeom Jie glared intensely at the back of Mok Jaehyun's head in front of him. He couldn't respond to that strange technique due to the restriction on his inner energy, but now that the restriction was being lifted, the situation would change. "I'll make you crawl between my legs." The restriction on killing was in place, but it didn't matter. As long as he didn't kill him, it was fine. Thinking about this, his mood became so good that the corners of his mouth curled up cruelly. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Beyond the mountain, there was a lodging building where they could rest. It was structured so that 2 people could rest in one room, so the boys each found someone they liked and chose their rooms. It didn't take very long. During this one-day rest period, the behavioral tendencies of the boys were divided into 2. The boys of the first tendency ate the snacks prepared in the room to satisfy their hunger, and then, without exception, they all began circulating their energy. They had fought a bloody battle all night, exhausting their minds and bodies, so they tried to restore their bodies to normal as much as possible through energy. Circulation. The boys of the second tendency were different from them. Although they also had a strong desire to rest, they judged that it was better to move first and secure teammates. Therefore, they attempted to approach the boys who were originally on the same team as them or those they had in mind. They were making a move in advance as the competition would intensify soon. And here, a third tendency also existed. Crack. Yeom Jie of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave, who had satisfied his hunger, stretched his body. He strongly wanted to circulate his energy like that guy sitting on the bed out of fatigue, but he judged that now was the right time, so he had to hurry. Now is the chance. His target was that bastard Mok Jaehyun. As long as he didn't kill him, he could turn him into a cripple, and then he wouldn't have to worry starting from this gate. The other guys couldn't match up to him anyway. However, that guy's strange technique and his unusually annoying presence bothered him. So I'll strike first. Now that the restriction was lifted, he was confident. Although that guy had learned a strange technique, Yeom Jie had reached the peak realm and had also mastered the Vermilion Slaughter Cave's secret arts. Then, shall we start the hunt? After stretching, Yeongjie grabbed the door and opened it. However, Mok Jae-eun was standing in front of the door with a smile on his face. You. Oh my. It seems we had the same thought. A smile filled with malice. For a moment, Yeongjie, who had been confidently stepping out, felt a chill run down his spine. Chapter 74. Team Leader. Part 2. Inside a red room illuminated by candlelight. This place was a brothel located on the outskirts of the outer fortress of the Heaven and Earth Society. On the table were red and white powder, along with brushes for applying makeup. There was someone looking at these with a serious expression. It was Ha Chai-rin, the prospective leader of the Flying Killing Sect, one of the 3 major assassin groups, or rather Go-chan, who had possessed her body. Thud. Go-chan, with his interlocked fingers supporting his chin. The face reflected in the mirror was so captivating that it could be called beautiful. However, this was not his own appearance. Do I have to go this far? Looking at the cosmetic tools on the table, Go-chan fell into self-loathing. How did it come to this point? As a servant spirit, his fate was tied to Mok Jae-eun, so he had chased after him all the way to the Heaven and Earth Society. In fact, if it were up to him, he wanted to run away, but since his life and death were tied to his master Mok Jae-eun, he had no choice. Damn it. Go-chan let out a deep sigh. Somehow he had made it all the way to the outer fortress of the Heaven and Earth Society. But when he actually tried to infiltrate the Heaven and Earth Society, he didn't know the security would be this strict. It's impossible. Even during his assassin days, he occasionally had infiltration missions. No, most assassinations required stealthy infiltration to be carried out. However, the scale of the Heaven and Earth Society, which currently controlled 1/3 of the martial world, was beyond imagination, and it was on a completely different level from the small and medium-sized sects he had infiltrated before. Ha! With trembling hands, Go-chan reached for the brush to apply the powder. The reason he was grasping these cosmetic tools was simple. It was to infiltrate the Heaven and Earth Society. Shudder. As he gripped the brush, Go-chan felt goosebumps all over his body. It was due to the deep-seated aversion inherent in his soul. The thought of him, a man, coming to this brothel to disguise himself as a courtesan made him feel so strongly repulsed that he even felt nauseous. However, there was no other way. In order to infiltrate, Go-chan had wandered around the outer fortress of the Heaven and Earth Society, gathering information. He had also considered the method of secretly entering the carts carrying supplies or food, but it was impossible because they thoroughly inspected them at the gates of the Heaven and Earth Society. In the end, the best method was to make contact with an insider and enter that way. Oh ho! So you're saying the young lady has come of age and wants to meet the heroes of the Heaven and Earth Society, is that right? That's right. Even though it was to gather information, to think he had to say such things. Even as he said those words, he felt uncomfortable. But it won't be easy to meet gentlemen of the rank of team leaders or division leaders, not just low-level warriors of the Heaven and Earth Society. Is there no way? Do you want to know? Ahem. Subtly extending his hand. As expected of an information broker, he had a keen eye for money. At this, Go-chan placed silver coins in his hand. After receiving the silver coins, the information broker readily divulged the method. Do you know Crimson Orchid House? Crimson Orchid House? That's right. It's a brothel located on the eastern outskirts of the outer fortress, and there. Bang! Are you telling me to become a courtesan? For a moment, it was so absurd that he almost snatched the money back from the information broker. The information broker appeased Go-chan and said, "Oh my. Listen to people until the end. Although Crimson Orchid House is a brothel, it's not an ordinary pleasure district. What's the difference between a brothel and a pleasure district? The courtesans there are not only outstanding in appearance but also excel in academics, arts, and skills, and possess dignity, so even high-ranking gentlemen from inside the fortress visit. Is that true?" After receiving the silver coins, would I lie? With the young lady's appearance, Crimson Orchid House will welcome you with open arms. Trusting these words, Go-chan eventually infiltrated Crimson Orchid House. As the information broker said, he had concerns, but he succeeded in entering Crimson Orchid House. When asked if he had any skills, he recalled the times he had disguised himself as a musician during his assassin days and played the Giamungo, and they truly welcomed him enthusiastically. You have artistic skills. We always welcome female musicians. On top of that, they mentioned that a few courtesans had become concubines of the Heaven and Earth Society's division leaders, creating vacancies. Concubines. Huh. It seems infiltration into the inner fortress is possible somehow. Go-chan swallowed dryly. And after hesitating several times, he finally picked up the brush and started applying powder to his face. Before long, the voice of the head courtesan of Crimson Orchid House could be heard from outside the door. Are you ready? Well. Go-chan, who was applying red powder to his lips, fumbled. Then, as if impatient from waiting outside, the head courtesan finally opened the door and entered. Creak. What's taking you so long to do your makeup? Since you have a pretty face, you can do it roughly. Let's see. How well did you do it? At these words, Go-chan looked at his own face in the mirror and couldn't hide his perplexity. He had tried his best, recalling Ha-Chiren's memories, but his hands must have shaken too much due to the instinctive aversion. The head courtesan approached and looked at Go-chan's face. Then she soon frowned and muttered. Oh my goodness! He had applied so much powder that his face was as white as a corpse. He had applied the ink so sloppily with the small brush meant for darkening the eyes that black tears were running down below his eyes, and he had drawn the red powder on his lips too long, making it look like his mouth was torn up to his ears. You've made yourself look like a demon. Go-chan no longer looked like a beauty but a ferocious demon. At the sight of the head courtesan clicking her tongue, Go-chan gritted his teeth. How did he end up doing something like this? Seduction my ass. It might have been better to risk his life and infiltrate instead. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Mok Jae-eun was standing in front of the door with a smile on his face. Seeing him like that, Young Jie was momentarily taken aback and at a loss for words. A smile filled with malice. The moment their eyes met, Young Jie felt a chill down his spine. The restrictions were lifted, allowing him to freely use his internal energy, so why was he being overwhelmed by the ominous aura emanating from this guy? In an instant, Young Jie gritted his teeth. He had intended to step forward, vowing to make the guy a cripple, but he was suddenly taken aback and felt like his momentum was stolen because the guy had appeared out of nowhere. As his displeasure intensified, Young Jie spoke with a terrifyingly distorted face. What do you mean by having the same thought? Is there any other reason? What? I thought you looked useful, so I was considering taking you as a teammate. Grit. Young Jie ground his teeth and slowly raised his internal energy. And he spoke to Mok Jae-eun in an agitated voice. You're going to take me as your teammate? Yes. Actually, I've been wanting to kill you since yesterday, but since the restriction of no killing is included in this gateway, I thought it would be better to just exploit you. Yeonga's eyes fiercely darted around. What nonsense was this impudent bastard spouting? Saying he wanted to kill him but it's better to exploit him? Grit. His teeth involuntarily ground together. Now that the internal energy restriction was lifted, how many among the boys did he think could compete with him? Young Jie couldn't hold back any longer. Swish. Young Jie, who had already completed the circulation of internal energy throughout his body, reached out his hand toward Mok Jae-eun's neck. He intended to grab his neck with his right hand, suppress his acupoints with his left hand in an instant, and drag him into the room. However, thwack. Ugh. Before he could do that, Mok Jae-eun's foot struck Yeonga's abdomen. It happened so fast that he couldn't even see it. Veins bulged on Yeonga's face, and his skin turned red as if it would burn. You bastard. Aren't legs longer than arms? Smack. Yeom Jie tightened his abdomen and kicked his toes toward Mok Jaehyun's femoral nerve. At this, Mok Jaehyun bent his leg and slightly retreated backward. Not missing that moment, Yeom Jie pushed off with his opposite foot, rotated his body, and tried to strike down on the top of Mok Jaehyun's head. Whirling kick. It was the third stance of the Vermilion Heaven Foot technique, which the Vermilion Slaughter Cave prided themselves on. It was a stance that deceived the path by raising the kick upward and then instantly rotated the body to strike downward. It was difficult to dodge because it was extremely fast and mixed with feints. However, swish! Mok Jaehyun lightly moved half a step and twisted his body to avoid the whirling kick. Yeomga's eyes narrowed. He never thought he would be able to dodge it so easily. But a stance is meant to be connected, so the next one was ready. Whoosh! Yeom Jie twisted his body and thrust his sword fingers toward Mok Jaehyun's Adam's apple. Having reached the peak realm, he could form sharpness with his energy, even if not as much as an actual sword. This is called piercing energy. Swish! However, whoosh! The piercing energy was about to pierce through Mok Jaehyun's Adam's apple. But before it could even touch, thwack! Mok Jaehyun's foot kicked Yeomga's leg like lightning. It was just a simple kick, so Yeom Jie didn't dodge it and instead sent internal energy to his leg to form a repulsive force. Based on his senses, he was superior to this guy in terms of internal energy. So if he protected his leg with internal energy, he thought he could sufficiently endure it. Thwack! Ugh! Yeomga's body, whose leg was kicked, instantly half-rotated to the side and his head slammed into the floor. For a moment, Yeom Jie was dazed. What on earth just happened? He couldn't understand why he couldn't dodge this guy's kick. It was fast, but the moment they collided, the repulsive force scattered. What? While he was doing that, Mok Jaehyun smiled and said, "You're weaker than I thought." You bastard! Yeom Jie, whose anger had risen to the top of his head, flicked his arm and rose to his feet while simultaneously aiming his kick technique at Mok Jaehyun's neck. Swoosh! Smack! Mok Jaehyun easily dodged it, then grabbed Yeomga's head and slammed it into the floor. Crash! The floorboard shattered, and Yeomga's head dug into the floor. It was painful, but Yeom Jie couldn't bear the humiliation, so he pulled up his internal energy to the fullest to try to raise his head again. But strangely, the energy focused on his neck and head scattered little by little, and he felt his strength drain instead. What is this? It was difficult to understand what phenomenon this was. While he was doing that, Mok Jaehyun grabbed Yeomga's hair and pulled it. Yank! As the embedded head was pulled out, sharp wooden splinters pierced various parts of his face, and blood flowed down. Looking at Yeomga's face like this, Mok Jaehyun smirked as if satisfied. Your face looks a bit better now. You. What did you do? What do you mean what did I do? Don't tell me you used something like scattered energy poison? Scattered energy poison? At Yeomga's words, Mok Jaehyun countered with a puzzled expression. He prided himself on knowing almost everything about poisons unless it was unusual, but it was the first time he had heard of something called scattered energy poison. Scattered energy poison. It was a strange poison made through a special manufacturing method that scattered internal energy once the conditions were met. Don't play dumb. If it's not scattered energy poison, then why is my internal energy scattering whenever I come into contact with you? Whenever he collided with Mok Jaehyun, the internal energy in that area scattered. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but when it happened twice, he couldn't help but think of scattered energy poison. Was there such an interesting poison? Is this bastard toying with me now? Yeom Jie, whose anger had reached the top of his head, soon gritted his teeth. Now that it had come to this, he thought he had no choice but to use the secret technique of Vermilion Slaughter Cave. The secret technique was an assassination move that inevitably killed the opponent, so he was told not to use it unless it was an exceptional case, but he couldn't bear it any longer. Thump thump. Yeom Jie concentrated his internal energy toward his chest. Then, the strange patterns drawn on his upper body glowed red. But at that moment... Thwack! Ugh! Mok Jaeyoung pulled Yeonga's hair back and smashed his fist down. But that wasn't the end. As if he was going to shatter Yeonga's face, Mok Jaeyoung kept striking with his fist. Thwack! Ack! St stop! Thwack! Stop! Thwack! Crack! The sound of his nose breaking and teeth shattering could be heard, but he didn't stop. Thwack! 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 There was no time to use the secret technique or anything. With the continuous strikes to his face, Yeonga had already lost consciousness. Huh! At that moment, hearing a sound from behind, Mok Jaeyoung turned his head with his fist raised. There was a boy who had woken up from the sound of fighting while circulating energy and refining his breath. What is going on? The boy couldn't hide his bewilderment when he saw Yeonga with his hair grabbed by Mok Jaeyoung's hand and his face turned into a bloody pulp. Toward this boy, Mok Jaeyoung waved his blood-stained hand and said with a smile, "Ah. Don't mind me and just continue what you were doing." Chapter 75. Team Leader. Part 3. Ah. Don't mind it and just continue what you were doing. Mok Jaeyoung, who was flicking his blood-stained hand and speaking nonchalantly. At this sight, the boy didn't know what to do. He was already happy to be staying in the same room as Yeonga from the Vermilion Slaughter Cave even for a short while, but in no time at all, he ended up in that state. What the hell is that guy? He fully acknowledged that Mok Jaeyoung had particularly stood out until the second gateway. But now, the restriction on internal energy was lifted. Yet, to do that to Yeonga of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave, whose internal energy restriction was lifted, not just anyone else, was that guy a monster? Mok Jaeyoung paid no attention to the boy's reaction. Rather, as if he was done with his business, he grabbed the hair of the unconscious Yeonga and dragged him out into the corridor. Ah! As the boy tried to get up, thinking he should stop this, "Why? Do you want to follow along too?" Mok Jaeyoung asked. At this, the boy faltered and, in his bewilderment, involuntarily shook his head rapidly. That's not it. You're wise. Then just stay there. Thud. As the door closed, the boy slumped onto the bed as if the strength had left his legs. He had no confidence to follow and help Yeonga. Mok Jaeyoung, who had come out of the room, looked at Yeonga's face and let out a small groan. The face that had been reduced to a pulp was quite prominent. The moment he saw Yeonga's tattoo glow red, he instinctively felt that the opponent was trying to kill him, so he had made him like this. You shouldn't have been so rough. That's true. At the blue spirit's voice, Mok Jaeyoung muttered softly. He had intended to beat him moderately and make him a teammate, but this went beyond the moderate level. However, apart from this result, there was one thing that differed from his expectations. Was the peak realm this week? After the restriction on internal energy was lifted, among the 80 boys, there were 7 who were estimated to have reached the peak realm. One of them was Yeonga of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave. The reason Mok Jaeyoung had chosen Yeonga as his first target was not only to have him as a teammate but also to test his own strength against him, who was showing explicit hostility toward him. But he was weaker than expected. He was slow. Even when he was in the Yun Mok Sword Manor, even if he could see the movements of those called first-class masters, his body's reaction was slow. But now, the movements of Yeonga, who could be called the peak realm, felt slow. That's what I want to say, mortal. The blue spirit was also inwardly surprised by the unexpected result. Although he had opened the middle dungeon through the subtle principles of the 8 thought-shattering techniques and his murderous energy had reached the pinnacle of peak realm in terms of internal energy, she had predicted that he would be on par or slightly ahead because he lacked enlightenment. However, Mok Jaeyoung had completely overwhelmed Yeonga. Is this guy's martial talent far exceeding my expectations? After confirming this, the excitement wouldn't subside. Although it was still far off, if this rate of progress continued, it was definitely worth looking forward to. Inwardly, she wanted to reveal her thoughts, but if the mortal became arrogant and neglected enlightenment, don't jump to conclusions. Although he subdued him quite easily, this time, that stupid guy's carelessness played a big part in it. At the blue spirit's words, Mok Jiangan shrugged his shoulders. There was some truth to her words. It was too early to determine the skill of a master who had reached the peak realm based on Yom Jie alone. But it's getting interesting. What is? I was curious how the energy of death would work, and now it has been confirmed. At these words, Mok Jiangan recalled what Yom Jie had said. If it's not scattered energy poison, then why is my internal energy scattering whenever I come into contact with you? Those words had been quite puzzling. Can you tell why that is? It seems to be offset by the energy of death. Offset? Yes. You said you experienced the phenomenon of energy dispersing when others injected true energy to occupy your acupoints or check your body's condition, right? Yes. The energy you possess is completely opposite to the energy of living humans. So you're saying that energy was offset because it's completely opposite? That's how it should be seen. The energy of yang and life will invigorate vitality, but your death energy rather brings death. Perhaps that further caused the energy to disperse. That had been the assumption so far. Since this was unprecedented in the history of the martial world, even she couldn't know exactly how this death energy would affect things in the future. But if this energy could really play the role of scattering the opponent's energy like scattered energy poison, it was as if a tremendous natural enemy had appeared for martial artists. It seems quite useful. To Mok Jiangan, who was pleased, the blue spirit said, just in case, make sure to control it. Control? Yes. If it becomes known that you can scatter the opponent's energy, you may face the vigilance of everyone before you fully mature. That could be the case. As she said, martial artists might become wary. If they were to fight Mok Jiangan, their internal energy would scatter during the fight, putting them at a significant disadvantage unless they possessed superior strength. How do I control it? Phew. Your learning order is really a mess. The blue spirit clicked her tongue. If he had reached the peak realm through the normal path, he would have properly grasped the method of transmitting energy. But despite being at the pinnacle, Mok Jiangan couldn't even perform the external meridians, which transmit energy directly, or the internal meridians and foot meridians that send energy within the body. I'll have to keep beating it into him whenever there's a chance. Now that the order was already messed up, there was no other way. While that was happening, they arrived at the lodging room. There was no one in the room. While everyone else was using a room for two, Mok Jiangan was an exception. Everyone unanimously refused to share a room with Mok Jiangan, but fortunately, there was a vacant room, so he ended up using it alone. Ugh. Just then, Yom Jie, who had been unconscious, woke up, letting out a groan. At this, Mok Jiangan looked down at him as if it was fortunate and made eye contact. Flinch. Yom Jie, who saw Mok Jiangan's face as soon as he woke up, momentarily felt nauseous. That's because while being beaten by Mok Jiangan to the point where his face became like this, he had fallen into extreme fear that he might die. As a result, he couldn't help but react like this. Have you come to your senses? You, what the hell? Ugh. Tui. Yom Jie felt pain and a foreign sensation in his mouth and spat something out. It was his broken tooth. His entire mouth was numb and filled with the taste of blood, as if he had bitten his tongue several times. Does it hurt a lot? Is that even a question? Yom Jie looked at Mok Jiangan with an absurd expression. To him, Mok Jiangan scratched his head and said, I hit you a bit too hard even though I wasn't going to kill you. But it doesn't seem too bad since you've gotten a more manly face. This bastard now. Is he toying with him? Even slightly moving his facial muscles hurt as if it was being burned by fire. He had made his face like this to the point where it was difficult to even open his eyes, yet the words he was saying sounded like he was provoking him. To such Yong-jie, Mok Jiang-un said. How about it? Do you want to join my team? Yong-jie gritted his teeth and barely squeezed out his voice. Uck off. He would rather die than ever be with this bastard. Although he knew he was no match, Yong-jie didn't want to submit to his opponent just because he had lost. At this, Mok Jiang-un lightly clapped his hands and said. Clap clap. An unyielding will that doesn't submit. What a pity. I thought you would be quite useful, so I wanted us to be on the same team. At Mok Jiang-un's words, Yong-jie, who had been inwardly tense, let out a sigh of relief. He was already worried that this crazy bastard might kill him regardless of the rules if he was in a bad mood. But it seemed he wasn't that impulsive. That was fortunate at least. Let's not associate with him. He had clearly realized it through this incident. This bastard was a crazy one who possessed ominousness itself, just as he had first felt. He knew that nothing good would come out of getting involved or provoking him. Tremble, tremble. Yong-jie tried to get up to leave the room as soon as possible. But then, Mok Jiang-un placed his finger on Yong-ga's forehead and lightly pushed. It wasn't much force, but Yong-jie, who was trying to get up, fell back down. Thud. What are you doing? Who said you could go? What is he talking about now? He had just spoken as if he was giving up on having him on his team, hadn't he? Then there was no reason for him to stay here. But what was he doing now? Swish. At that moment, Mok Jiang-un took out a wooden puppet from his bosom. And then, with one hand, he formed a hand seal and chanted an incantation. The origin of fate, the cycle of reincarnation, release. What did he do just now? Yong-jie, who didn't know much about sorcery techniques, couldn't hide his bewilderment at Mok Jiang-un's strange behavior. So he tried to draw out the energy from his danjian, damn it. He hadn't noticed, but at some point, his acupoints had been occupied. No wonder he couldn't put any strength into his body. While that was happening, a sudden eerie sensation sent chills down his spine. Seep seep. It felt like something was seeping into his body, and the sensation was so unpleasant and chilling that it was hard to endure. Ugh. You? What are you doing to me? Ugh. Twitch twitch. Yong-ga's lower back curved like a shrimp. To him, Mok Jiang-un smiled and said, I'll make good use of that body. What the hell is that? Ugh. Thump thump. Black veins were bulging out all over Yong-ga's neck and face, and his appearance was nothing short of hideous. But it didn't last very long. Yong-ga's body, which had been twisting and turning, his eyes rolling back and convulsing, had somehow returned to normal. Of course, when he opened his eyes, someone else had taken residence inside. How is the body? Demonic monk. It seems usable. The vengeful spirit that had possessed him was none other than Demonic Monk. Demonic Monk, who had obtained a young body that had reached the peak realm, showed a satisfied expression. You should have given it to me in a more intact state. At those words, Demonic Monk touched his face a few times, and the broken nose bridge straightened, and the face somewhat returned to its original form. Oh ho! This seemed quite interesting. While the broken parts couldn't be greatly fixed, it had improved considerably. At Mok Jiang-un's reaction, the blue spirit said, adjusting the possessed body to a desired state to some extent is not a difficult task. Unlike humans whose souls are bound, we can freely manipulate the bodies we occupy. It seems so. There seemed to be a way to make use of this as well. While that was happening, thump thump. At the sound of approaching footsteps, Mok Jiang-un looked toward the door. Someone was approaching the room he was in. The footsteps were light in weight, but judging from the somewhat unnatural sound, the condition of the approaching person didn't seem too good. Knock knock. At that moment, someone who had arrived in front of the door knocked. Come in. At this, the door opened, and an unexpected person revealed themselves. It was none other than Mo Harang of the Demon Fire Hall. Although she had received treatment, he thought she would be focusing on restoring her body while circulating energy and refining her breath due to her injuries, so why had she come here? At that moment, the green spirit Gyu Soha's voice reached Mok Jaehyun's ears. Master! Master! Give me that human's body. It seemed he liked Mo Harang's body. At this, the blue spirit said, You brat. You insisted you were a man, so why are you clamoring for a woman's body? Gyu Soha shut her mouth. Not paying attention to their conversation, Mok Jaehyun said with a light smile, What brings you here? Swish. At that question, Mo Harang's gaze turned to demonic monk, who had possessed the body of Yom Jie of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave behind Mok Jaehyun. At this, Mok Jaehyun nonchalantly said, Ah. This person has agreed to join our team. At those words, demonic monk nodded his head, pretending to be Yong-ga. Seeing this, Mo Harang turned her head toward Mok Jaehyun and said, What did you do? What do you mean what did I do? That's not Yong-ga. At those words, one of Mok Jaehyun's eyebrows slightly rose. What confidence did this woman have to say such a thing? Mok Jaehyun nonchalantly said. What are you talking about? That guy with a strong sense of pride wouldn't easily submit to you. And Yom Jie is not the type to go under someone else. At her words, Mok Jaehyun smirked. Come to think of it, he recalled that she was quick-witted enough to quickly deduce his purpose just by seeing his actions during the flag battle. And didn't she say their eyes met? Mo Harang had said that her eyes had met with the green spirit Gyu Soha. At that time, he didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it could have been a coincidence. But if that was true, could this woman also have the talent of a diviner? Mok Jaehyun, who had become interested, pointed at Yom Jie with a hand gesture and opened his mouth. Then, if this person is not Yom Jie, what is he? I don't know. If you don't know, why did you say that? I saw it. Saw what? That ghost-like thing that was wearing chains next to you. She spoke as if she herself was half believing whether this was true or not. She wanted to know if what she saw was real. If it was true, then this man could be said to be manipulating a ghost, a strange being. Ghost-like thing, you say? At that time, my mind was hazy, but I saw you conversing with it. Even as she said these words, she trailed off as if she herself wasn't confident about what she had seen. At this, Mok Jaehyun stared at her with a smiling face. Mo Harang became confused by that sight. As someone from the Demon Fire Hall, known as one of the 4 major assassin groups, she had undergone numerous training, which included the skill to read people's psychology through their expressions and eyes. I can't read him. However, Mok Jaehyun's expression and eyes were impossible to gauge. She could read simple emotions, but anything beyond that was impossible. At this, she bit her lip tightly. Is it a misunderstanding? She was telling him about her speculations and what she had seen, but Mok Jaehyun showed no particular reaction. Rather, he only showed eyes that seemed intrigued. Because of this, she thought that she might be doing something unnecessary. Therefore, in the end, she said, Sorry. I must have been seeing things because of the severe bleeding at that time. With those words, she tried to turn around and leave the room. But then, Papa Pack. The origin of fate, the cycle of reincarnation, release. A sound resembling chanting and incantation was heard from behind. At this, Mo Harang stopped in her tracks and slowly turned her head. Shudder. As she turned her head, goosebumps rose all over her body. Next to Mok Jaehyun, she saw a translucent and blurry figure of a girl with half-white hair, wearing chains. Ah! What she had seen at that time was real. While she was feeling amazed, the green spirit Gyu Soha stretched out her hand, and chains swiftly wrapped around Mo Harang's body. As her body was restrained by the chains, Mok Jaehyun spoke with a smile filled with malice. The price for seeing what you wanted is quite steep, but are you okay with that? Chapter 76. Team Leader. Part 4. Titan. The eyes of Mo Harang of the Demon Fire Hall trembled. The faint form of chains enveloping her body looked like an illusion, but when she tried to move, they tightened further and restrained her. She tried to draw up her internal energy, but Mok Jayangan approached her and said, "The price for seeing what you wanted is quite steep, but are you okay with that?" A smiling face. But that smile was truly filled with malice. There was no killing intent, so how could he smile like that? In an instant, she recalled a story she had heard before. Among thousands and tens of thousands, there are those born with a murderous nature. What is that? It's a disposition that finds joy, pleasure, and a reason for existence in death and destruction. Isn't that dangerous? It is dangerous. But if they can be properly tamed, they can be said to be the best material for assassins. The best? Yes. Those with a murderous nature have no hesitation in killing someone. That's why they don't get swayed emotionally. So that can become a talent. That was still when the Demon Fire Hall was called one of the 4 major assassin groups. She thought that perhaps Mok Jayangan might be the murderous nature her father had spoken of back then. If that was the case, she might have touched on something dangerous. But that didn't matter. Mo Harang looked straight into Mok Jayangan's eyes and said, "I will pay any price." Any price? If it means uncovering a secret, I'm prepared for it. Prepared. But there's only one life, so can there be any price? Mok Jayangan still had a smiling face. But the words coming out were extremely brutal. "Master, give me this human's body." The green spirit, Gyu Soha, said with a greedy gaze. Hearing this voice, Mo Harang flinched in surprise and looked at Gyu Soha. At this, Gyu Soha tilted her head and muttered, "Human. You can hear my voice too? Oh ho." At those words, the blue spirit also showed interest. That's because although she deliberately revealed her appearance, she didn't make her voice audible. But being able to hear this meant, "It seems the spiritual eye has opened." Spiritual eye? Yes. Unlike you, who has opened the demon eye to see the inner essence, it seems you have gained the eye to see souls at the crossroads of life and death. The blue spirit called it the spiritual eye. Perhaps unable to hear her voice, Mo Harang couldn't take her eyes off Gyu Soha. Mo Harang cautiously parted her lips. "Are you really a ghost? What? Do I look like a mere human to you?" Gyu Soha raised the corners of his mouth. The fear of living humans was no different from nourishment for vengeful spirits. However, Mo Harang showed a different emotion than fear. Ah. It seemed elevated somehow. It was close to the emotion felt when seeing something one had been wanting to find. At this, Mok Jayangan said to her, "You're showing an interesting reaction. Is seeing the dead your wish or something?" No. No. That's not it. Mo Harang's voice trembled. She turned her head to look at Mok Jayangan, and then, as if making a resolution, she spoke with force in her neck. "I will pay any price you want. Even if it means my life." At her words, the interest in Mok Jayangan's eyes faded away. Having seen countless deaths, he had come to be able to distinguish to some extent between those who were truly prepared for death and those who weren't, and she was closer to the former. She was prepared to stake her life if necessary. To such Mok Jayangan, she continued, "But help me in return." Help you, you say?" Mok Jayangan muttered as if annoyed. And then, bringing his finger to her throat, he said, "Why should I do that? It's just a bother. Press." His finger pressed into where her Adam's apple was. At this, she spoke with unwavering eyes. "Body. That ghost said it wants a body, right? If you grant my request, I'll give you this body as much as you want. It seems like you're trying to make a deal, but even now, I can take your body without having to do that." At Mok Jayangan's words, Mo Harang's eyes sharpened. At that moment, a sharp energy spread from her body. Clang! Clang! Then, the chains created by Gyu Soha's spiritual power were cut off. At some point, sharp daggers were held in both of Mo Harang's hands. The daggers were imbued with flickering killing energy, which was honed much sharper than that of Yom-Ga of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave. "Step back," the blue spirit warned. At this, Mok Jayangan stepped back about half a step and slightly shook his head to the side. At that moment, several trajectories drew lines in front of his eyes and narrowly grazed past Mok Jayangan. If he had been a little late, a part of his body, including his chin, would have been cut off. No, it was slightly cut. Trickle. A drop of blood flowed down where the trajectory had passed. Thread? It was much thinner than thread but had elasticity. This thread-like thing tied behind the hilt of the dagger embedded in the floor surrounded the area to prevent movement. Mo Haring spoke in a chilling voice. "Don't underestimate me too much." Killing intent was emanating from her voice. At this, Mok Jayangan smirked and said, "You had a hidden trick up your sleeve." While that was happening, the blue spirit's voice was heard. "I thought I had seen that dagger technique somewhere before, but she has inherited the lineage of the Killing King." The lineage of the Killing King? As soon as Mok Jayangan's question ended, a glint appeared in Mo Haring's eyes. She spoke in a tone of incomprehension. "What are you?" Mo Haring was genuinely amazed. She never thought the words "lineage of the Killing King" would come out of Mok Jayangan's mouth. It would be stranger not to think of the Killing King after seeing the linked kill and the flash shadow flying dagger technique. Mok Jayangan directly repeated those words of the blue spirit. It would be stranger not to think of the Killing King after seeing the linked kill and the flash shadow flying dagger technique. At those words, Mo Haring's eyes widened. Many people knew about the linked kill, so there were few who didn't know about it. However, the flash shadow flying dagger technique was different. This was a secret technique that only the sect leader of the Demon Fire Hall could learn. It was literally a secret technique, and since it was not used unless the opponent had to be killed or was too difficult to handle, it was hardly known. And the Killing King is the predecessor of our sect. It's a story passed down only orally within our sect, known only to the sect leader and the successors, so how does he know that? It was in that moment of her confusion. Mok Jayangan strongly stomped on the floor. Then, the floorboard was pressed down, and the part where the dagger was embedded rose upward. At the same time, the thin threads tightly surrounding the area loosened. Swish! In this instant, Mok Jayangan flew toward her in one breath and grabbed her neck. Of course, Mo Haring didn't just stand still either. The moment Mok Jayangan charged, she immediately came to her senses and stabbed the dagger toward Mok Jayangan's heart, as she had practiced thousands and tens of thousands of times. No, to be precise, only the tip of the dagger slightly penetrated. Fast. Grab. If Mok Jayangan hadn't grabbed her wrist with his left hand, it would have penetrated even deeper. That's how fast her movements were, making it difficult to respond even when seen with the eyes. It was clear that Mo Haring was much stronger than Yom-Ga of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave. Crack. Tremble. As Mok Jayangan applied more strength to his hand, she frowned at the pain that felt like her wrist would break. Even in the midst of that, seeing her not let out a single moan, Mok Jayangan chuckled. "You're strong. When did you put this around my neck?" Slide. A silver thread was somehow wrapped around Mok Jayangan's neck. The dagger that had been embedded in the floor and bounced upward was hanging from the ceiling, and if Mo Haring pulled her hand, his neck would have been tightened. "Why aren't you pulling it?" "You're not squeezing my neck either." Just as she said, Mok Jayangan was gripping Mo Haring's neck with his right hand but wasn't applying strength. That's why she hadn't pulled the thread either. Honestly speaking, if she pulled this, Mok Jayangan's neck would be cut off, so she had refrained from doing so. Beyond this point, it was truly the territory of killing each other. If I kill him, it's a violation of the restriction in this gateway. And she still had something she wanted from Mok Jayangan. That's why she couldn't kill him. Swish. At that moment, Mok Jayangan released his hand from the neck he was holding and lightly touched her thread with his finger. In that instant, the taut thread soon became limp. Mo Haring's eyes widened. She was definitely sending true energy through the thread, but as if it had dispersed, the thread no longer obeyed her. What is this? She couldn't understand. While she was doing that, Mok Jaehyun said, "You seem quite useful." What? I was going to give you to Soha as a body, but it doesn't seem bad to just use you myself. What are you talking about now? You said you would pay any price for what you want, right? At Mok Jaehyun's words, Mo Haring momentarily hesitated. She had definitely agreed to that, but perhaps because of Mok Jaehyun's suddenly changed attitude, she found herself hesitating for a moment. But then, Mok Jaehyun suddenly grabbed her collar and pulled her. Ah! Crack! And then, he forcibly moved her wrist that had stabbed the dagger and twisted it in the direction he was in. She wanted to draw up her energy to block this, but the true energy she sent to her wrist kept dispersing, draining her strength, and she couldn't do anything about it. Crack! At some point, the dagger she was holding was pointed toward her face. Was he really trying to kill her? While that was happening, something fell and wet her lips. It was none other than a drop of blood. Drip drip. Mok Jaehyun's blood, which had been on the tip of the blade, was about to fall into her mouth. When she tried to close her mouth, Mok Jaehyun said, "Open it." What was he talking about? She couldn't understand why he was doing this. However, judging that he wasn't trying to kill her, she soon opened her mouth without questioning it. Then, the drop of blood that had been on the tip of the dagger fell into her mouth. Swallow it. She did as she was told. The moment she swallowed the drop of blood that had entered her mouth, her chest became extremely hot. A burning pain was engulfing her body, and it was so agonizing that she forcibly shook off the hand Mok Jaehyun was holding and immediately tried to sit cross-legged. Poison. It's poison. A pain that twisted her internal organs. She was convinced that this was poison. As a descendant of the Demon Fire Hall, known as one of the 4 major assassin groups, she was somewhat well-versed in poisons and had even ingested some deadly poisons to build up resistance to them. However, Mok Jaehyun's blood was incomparable to that. How can blood have such poison? The poison was too strong, as if numerous poisons had been concentrated. The word deadly poison was insufficient. If I don't circulate energy quickly. Smack. As she tried to sit cross-legged, Mok Jaehyun kicked her stomach with his foot. Ugh. The pain of her internal organs twisting was already agonizing, and being kicked in the abdomen made her so distressed that she felt like killing Mok Jaehyun right away. You. Smack. At that moment, Mok Jaehyun pressed down on her shoulder near the collarbone with his foot and said, "You said you would pay any price. Then, from this moment on, I'd like you to become a faithful dog. You don't have to go this far." No, that won't do. I never trust people. Mo Haring's eyes trembled. She felt like she had made a huge mistake. This person was more twisted than she had imagined. It couldn't be defined as a murderous nature or whatever, it was truly evil itself. The boys who had given up even circulating energy and resting in order to gather teammates and were going around the rooms. They couldn't hide their surprise when they saw a group walking down the corridor. Oh? Is this for real? What? No way. They doubted their own eyes. The two, a man and a woman, followed behind Mok Jaehyun on both sides. They were the descendants of the Vermilion Slaughter Cave and Demon Fire Hall, who were called the most promising in this gateway trial of Corpse Blood Valley. Now that the restriction on internal energy was lifted, everyone had expected that. Each and every one of them would naturally become the team leader and lead others. But what was this? Could it be that those 2 team leader level individuals had joined under that guy?